All right. So one of the things, I want to be really clear about what I mean about feminism. And excuse me, sorry. One of the things that when people think of the word feminism, a lot of feelings might come up. So I want to be super clear that this quote right here kind of, speaks to this idea of what feminism is. So women don't want to be promoted solely based on our gender. We want the access to the opportunity to create and innovate without limitations because of our gender. We want it to be recognized that barriers and unequal advantages still exist and need to be rectified. That is feminism. Okay, so that, a lot of times if you have someone saying, oh, well, they're man haters, or feminism is about bra burning, which is actually a myth. They did not burn bras at that point. There was a picture of a barrel of they're acting like, oh, we might do that, but it actually was not what was happening. And that was during the Miss America pageant is where that bra burning idea came from. So anyway, but something to understand is that all feminism is asking for equal access to the opportunities. That's it. So when somebody is trying to say, well, feminism, does this and that, that's actually not what it is. It's just equal access to opportunities. Okay. So in this webinar, we will learn about different feminist movements. We'll evaluate how our socialization and education has led to a lack of knowledge about some of these movements. We'll be exposed to interrupting these biases, and also through, I'm so sorry. My mouse disappears. I have this new computer and my mouse will disappear for no reason. And so we be exposed to interrupting these biases early through children's literature. So my daughter right now is reading Rebel Girls, and it's Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls. And I'll show you a couple of children's literature that you can actually can look at and talk to your little girls and boys about this. Then also, what can we do to better support women now? So we will have some really good, thoughtful action steps for you to think about. So this idea of cultural humility is something that I use a lot in my workshops, and I think it's a really good place to start. A lifelong process of self-reflection, self-critique, and commitment to understanding and respecting different points of view, and engaging with others humbly, authentically, and from a place of learning. And I had turned off my Instagram things, but for some reason they're still going off. Okay, so when we start from that place of cultural humility, it's really suspending these ideas about who we think we are and really looking at how can I come at this and understand this history, not from a place of judgment of myself, denial of our history or anything else, but just a pure understanding of why we are where we are. So that starts with our socialization. So when we look about our childhood, think about to your messages of what that was like to be a girl and what were some of the messages that you got. So if you were growing up, all different generations will talk to us about, girls will have pink, boys will have blue. So when I was pregnant with my daughter, it was this idea around the pink and blue thing, and folks didn't know what kind of colors to get for her because I wasn't telling anybody what her gender was. I knew, but what was interesting is that I was like, oh, we'll just get yellows and greens. And you would think that I was asking people to cut off their right arm with like trying to figure out what to get this child without knowing their gender. And I think that is from the very beginning that speaks to how we are socialized from the moment before we even get to, let me move that out of the way, to, what is it about our socialization that really speaks to this blue and pink thing? Sorry, I'm getting a little distracted by that survey, so I'm just gonna put it down. Anyway, so, the other thing is, what were the messages that you got? Like, what could girls do and what could boys do? What toys were for girls, what toys were for boys? And that's really important too, to understand that if boys are always geared towards engineering toys, things that are mechanical, things that they can take apart, and girls are geared towards more domestic things like little kitchens or dolls or things like that, then that speaks to them like, this is for you and this is for the boys. And this is just the path that you're on. And it's not always an intentional thing. And I know for me, growing up in the 80s, it was, I felt like things were a little bit more gender neutral. I remember I had a little Barbie that had a data processing center, and I loved that thing. She was over there pressing those buttons, doing her Barbie processing. And she, you know, my dad was a scientist and was in the military and talked a lot about data. And my sisters, if they're listening to this, they're probably laughing at that. But that's, you know, I really thought that was cool. So, you know, just thinking back for just a moment, what were some of the things that you were indoctrinated with this idea of what could girls do? The other thing that we look at a lot is body image. And I have a great book. I'm going to throw out a lot of books as I'm talking, but one of them is from one of our publishers. So it's called The Body Is Not an Apology. And that's great because this woman is Sonia Renee Taylor. She talks about radical self-love and radical self-acceptance. So that's really important for us to really look at how do magazines and media and social media shape who we are and the way we see ourselves and the way that we've grown up to see other women. Because if you think about one of the ways that women can get back at another woman is by talking about her looks. And so we really want to get away from doing that. And we really want to look at the deep root of why women sabotage each other. What does that look like? And how do we stop doing that? And if we know our history, then we're much better able to understand, oh yeah, of course, that that white women and women of color have a very contentious history. And that's because of our, you know, and why we're not getting along sometimes today, or why it might be hard to communicate with each other today. And that is because of our socialization, the ways that we've grown up in a race-based and class-based society, and of course, gender-based society, and also our whole history of why we were divided in the first place. So that leads me then into our history. So this is a poll for you. Have you heard of the 4 waves of feminism? And if you take the survey below, you'll see this blinking light and the polling button. And if you can just answer that real quick. All right, so we'll keep seeing what people say there. So the first wave of feminism, so I'm going to talk about 4 waves of feminism. Some people might know about 3. We're actually in the 4th wave. But the first wave started 1800s-ish, 1820s-ish to about 1920. And at this point, this is all about the suffragettes, trying to get the vote, abolitionist women, what they were doing, legally denied to married women were owning property rights and economic justice. So these were some of the things that were really important at that time for women to get. You might have heard of, or may not have heard of, Maria Stewart. She was one of the first Black women to speak publicly in, to a mixed gendered audience, and that was in 1830. Sojourner Truth, or I put her SJ up here, is in 1828. She wins the first case against a white man, and that was to get her son back from an enslaved condition. So she actually had escaped from slavery and she was trying to get her son back. And at this point, 1837, it was the Anti-Slavery Convention. The Fugitive Slave Act happened shortly thereafter, 1850. Now that was a really contentious time. All of this was contentious, but Fugitive Slave Act happened when they had just freed, in the North, if there were any slaves that had escaped to the North, some of the Southerners could go up to the North and bring them back. So if they may be part of Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad at that time, they might have gone and escaped to the North. People from the South could get bounty hunters and bring those slaves back during the Fugitive Slave Act. And so that was a way for them to keep slavery alive, really. In 1870, though, and I'm giving you all a very brief, so in our more in-depth details about this. So I'm not, I'm just trying to kind of give you the overview. So in 1870, Black men were given the right to vote. And at this point, this is when it started to divide Black women and white women in the suffragettes and the abolitionist movement. And the reason why that is because Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were kind of the leaders of the suffragette movements. But we also have other women that were doing that work as well. Other Black women like Ida B. Wells, and some other women I'll show you here in just a second. What happened was that Frederick Douglass had said, if Black people don't get the right to vote now, we are facing violence. We're being hung in town squares. We are facing violence, like sheer violence. White women are not facing the kind of violence that we are. It's not to diminish what white women were going through, but it was nothing compared to what Black people were going through at that time. And so it was very important to Frederick Douglass that Black men get the vote so that at least Black issues could be brought to the forefront. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony said, nope, we're done. And so what they did was they actually went to the South and started working with white women from the South who obviously were not into allowing Black people to get the vote at all. And so they started using the power and the privilege of the white women from the South and the funding from them to actually get the suffragette movement going. And so even during the Women's March, later on, late 1800s, early 1900s, Ida B. Wells and her team were told to go to the back of the parade or of the march, and they refused. And so even then, we even talk about before the first wave, how in slavery, there's a great book called They Were Her Property. And it talks about the brutality that the white mistresses of the plantations were doing to the slaves. So this, of course, was not starting in the first wave. This was way before the first wave. But the first wave is kind of where we start the book and where we really start to talk about the actual movement of feminism. So these are some of the women that were doing this work, alongside and before even Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Frances Harper, Anna Julia Cooper, and Ida B. Wells all started this National Association of Colored Women in 1896. At that time, too, the book Voices from the South was also published, and that was like a precursor to Black feminism. Mary Church Terrell was the president, and at this point, they were really looking at Black women's issues in particular. They had kind of, gotten away from the suffragettes and the white feminism that was not benefiting them. So by 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, but mostly benefited white women. There's a lot of disenfranchisement going on in the South, but also even in the North. There were reading tests, there were long voting lines, and there's even violence at the polls, especially in the South. That is not that much different from now. My co-author, Camille Anderson, was talking about during the 2016 election, how in Atlanta, they were being redirected a lot of times on voting day to enable to, they had to change locations of where they were going to vote. So even now, it's still happening. There's a lot of disenfranchisement happening with voting. So then we get into the second wave. And the second wave in the 1960s and 70s, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 started to happen. The 50s, 60s, and 70s is where the second wave really started to piggyback off of what was happening in the first wave. But they were also looking at equal pay, housing and welfare rights, infant mortality, and the ratification of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. So some key people were Audre Lorde. She was a Black woman and also a lesbian, and so she has that intersectionality, which I'll talk about in a second. Basically, it's intersecting identities, and Kimberly Crenshaw came up with this idea of intersecting race and gender. And so Black feminism and other movements like the Chicanx and Mujerista movement, and the reason why it's not Chicana or Chicano is the Nahua language, is the indigenous language, has the X sound, it's so she. And Chicanx, X means that it's non-gender binary. And so that is the way that spelling is, in case you're wondering. The Mujerista movement was looking at immigration, classism, workers' rights. Dolores Huerta at that time was one of the forerunners of workers' rights. Asian feminism was really looking at immigration, linguistic capital. Also, there was a lot of misogyny within these cultures as well that they were also dealing with. Indigenous peoples was looking at colonialism, treaties, environmental justice, the effects of poverty and long-term colonization. And the LGBTQI movement was looking at poverty, discrimination, and being able to come out safely. And later on, as you know, in the 80s, the AIDS crisis happened. So healthcare was also very important at that time. So some key players here were Angela Davis, who I just saw not too long ago, about a year ago. She came to Western. I was super excited. I started to cry. She is just a badass, if you ever want to know a badass. And I have some of her books actually on my shelf behind me. Dolores Huerta, Women of the Black Power Movement. Bell Hooks, if you don't know Bell Hooks, she wrote Feminism is for Everybody. Ella Baker is actually one of the forerunners of the civil rights movement, and along with Rosa Parks and other people you probably already know, but Ella Baker is somebody to put onto your list of women. Madonna Thunderhawk was the Women of All Red Nations, and they started this whole thing around environmental justice. So if you see the Dakota Access Pipeline, those are the folks that are behind that. And so these are people that are looking at particular issues for their particular cultural identities. And so there's a lot of different people, and I'll show you some more even. So at this point, then we get into the third wave. And the third wave is 1980s to about early 2000s. It's kind of before the social media started and the internet. I mean, I know the internet was around sort of in 2001, but from what I remember, I lived in China at the time, and it was not great. So it was okay. Like Google was around, but it wasn't like it is now with social media. So at this point, the third wave is really, it started kind of with Anita Hill and the Clarence Thomas testimony in 1991. This was also around the time that Bill Clinton was president, and the whole Monica Lewinsky thing and slut shaming and all these things happened around workplace sexual harassment. And this is around the time that the sexual harassment training was required. If you remember, in 1980, 9 to 5 was filmed. So it was really top of mind for women at that point, talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. Finally, we got access to the workplace, but now we're being harassed there. Also, sexual assault on college campuses was really getting a lot of attention. Amy Wolf was one of the women really looking at what was happening on college campuses. And of course, that's still happening. And as a professor, we have lots of resources now, but that's still happening. Media representation, so really looking at why are women being portrayed as sexualized objects all the time. And if you ever go to one of my women workshops, I have a whole lot of images and a whole lot of things. So if you were at the San Antonio Women's Leadership Summit that I did a couple of weeks ago, that like the room was mad. So it actually looking at the way we see how women are sexualized in perfume ads and everything else, it's just the media representation is very difficult to look at, and to see how women are tone policed and policed on their outfits and their bodies and fat shamed and slut shamed and all the different things that happen to women when you're in the workplace. And also when you're just trying to live your life and see media ads everywhere. So they were really trying to deconstruct that in the third wave. The other thing that was happening was reproductive rights. So Roe v. Wade was happening during the second wave, but now, as you know, with the Supreme Court justice, they're trying to reverse Roe v. Wade. And that is something that's been happening again and again and again. And as we get more conservative Supreme Court justices, we start to see that that actually might get overturned if we all don't come together and do something about that. The thing that I want to say about sterilization is that Black women during the 50s, 60s, and even earlier before that, were being forcibly sterilized. And so for them, reproductive rights looks a little bit differently. They want to have the right to be able to have children if they want to, not be forcibly sterilized. And that's not necessarily happening now, but healthcare for Black women is not great right now. And there's a higher infant mortality rate for Black women specifically. The way that Black people are treated in healthcare institutions, many times their pain is not seen as real. It's not seen as bad. And so they're not always given the medications that they're needed. And so that was something that was important to Black women, in particular, women of color. The other thing is equal pay. And right now, if we are on the trajectory that we started in 2001, we will actually not get pay equity until 2054. For women of color, that's maybe 2152. So we will not reach pay equity. So all of these things are really important. And even now with this, with the quarantine and things like that, it's really important to understand that, you know, women are really suffering under this quarantine because we're not able to do the work that we're supposed to be doing. And sometimes that domestic work will fall on us. Like right now, I'm homeschooling my child by myself, and I'm taking care of her by myself. And she's in a room right now homeschooling herself while I'm doing this webinar. So, you know, there's an extra layer of burden that happens for women, especially when we're the ones doing the nurturing, the caretaking. We might be taking care of elderly folks in our lives. We might be taking care of a whole lot of other things that get layered on top of what we're already doing for our work. And men don't necessarily face those same things. And that's just the way that society has built women's roles. And so if we don't talk about it, then we're not really able to push back on it. And the other thing that I would say is that when men ask for paternity leave, that shows that family leave is important for both parents. So all of these things are things that have been happening during the third wave. Also, women and ethnicity studies were being offered on campus. Maxine Hong Kingston is a great person. Woman Warrior is one of the things that she wrote. So lots of great people. I am the third wave. So these are the women of the third wave. So we have Rebecca Walker, and she and her mother, Alice Walker, so Alice Walker kind of coined this idea or started this idea of womanism. And Alice Walker was really looking at, with womanism, you know, feminism was kind of co-opted by white women. And so what Alice said, and she's the one that wrote Color Purple, she said, womanism is really looking at the totality, the holistic of not just white women's issues, but women of color. So looking at this idea of environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, indigenous sovereignty, and looking at the treaties. I mean, looking at everything. And also looking at the LGBTQI movement and the trans movement. So anyway, so that is something that Rebecca Walker picked up when she wrote in Ms. Magazine, I Am the Third Wave. And she started talking about right after this whole Anita Hill thing happened with Clarence Thomas. And basically she was sidelined and belittled and dismissed with all the things that Clarence Thomas had done to sexually harass her. Rebecca Walker said, oh, I can see that this is what's happening to women right now. So she says, I'm the third wave now of feminism, and we're going to really look at these issues of sexual harassment. So then you have people like Sanal Sarahan. She is an activist out of Turkey, and she's a staunch women's activist. So I kind of put some global folks in there. Judith Butler was a lesbian activist as well. So she brought in the idea of lesbianism and the LGBTQI movement. Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, coined intersectionality. And Susan Faludi and Naomi Wolf were really looking at college campuses. And Susan Faludi wrote Backlash, and a huge book all about what's happening with feminism. So now that leads us up to the fourth wave. And I have a friend of mine over here, Ijeoma Aluo. She went to Western, and if you are not following her on social media, she is great. She talks a lot about how to have conversations about race. And so the fourth wave is really looking at all different kinds of things. Gender expression, intersectionality, body sex positivity. So that kind of goes into this radical self-love movement, and fat positivity. So let me go into gender expression. So up here where I am, I'm in Seattle, north of Seattle. And I think depending on where you are geographically, how much this has taken off and how much of it has not. So gender expression, what I love about my college campus is that I go there and I see all kinds of gender expression. They're what used to be called androgyny, for those of you a little bit older. Right now, it's non-binary. It's called non-binary. And I love to see that my students are embracing that wholeheartedly. And so gender expression is something that's just breaking up. When you look at like the trans movement, you just break up the whole gender binary to begin with, that men don't have to do this and women don't have to do this. If you just break it up Don't look at, you know, what parts you have, but looking at how do we just want to express ourselves? And why does that have to be so gendered? Because gender is a social construct. And so the fourth wave, what's exciting about that is that the LGBTQI and trans movement has really brought this idea of exciting ways to break up the gender binary. If you're a girl, you can do whatever you want. If you're a boy, you can do whatever you want. I just find it totally fascinating. We talk about this in the book a lot, about the trans movement. But also women getting access to political power and looking at environmentalism. And so when we look at people like the Squad, the House of Representatives, but even Sonia Sotomayor and having a Supreme Court justice, women are getting access to power. Now we do have two white, and Bernie might have just decided to drop out, but we still have a long way to go, because we all know kind of what happened with Hillary and what happened to the women that were running for president now. So, you know, what I would say is if we, I'm even thinking about running for office. I have no political experience, but you know what? My gosh, we need to all run. So also the social media influencers. So Ijeoma is one of those people. She's a social media influencer, and there's a lot of great people that are doing that work. And so at this point, 2019, Virginia just ratified the 37th state to ratify the ERA. However, there was a deadline on the Equal Rights Amendment. And right now it's stopped at the Supreme Court because they're saying, well, in 1982, there was a deadline for all 37 states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. Well, you know, that's passed. So what are we going to do? So right now it's up for the Supreme Court. So it might not pass just because of that little deadline problem. So we're really looking at how do we get that to pass despite the deadline. So in 2016, we had the election of Trump, which really raised a lot of consciousness for women. And I think white women really kind of started to wake up. I think women of color were already woken up and already knew what was happening. But I think white women, they're starting to think, huh. So that's also when the Women's March happened in 2017. And that was still feeling quite divided for women of color. I was asking a friend of mine, I was like, are you going to go march? And she's Filipinx. And she said, why would I do that? That march is not for me. If I go there and march, the first person they're going to arrest is me as a woman of color. So I'm not interested. And I thought that was really telling. And I think that's a good wake-up call for white men to understand why it's a very different experience for women of color. We also have the Supreme Court justices, the coronavirus effects on working mothers, all of these things. So coronavirus now is going to be one of those big, huge key events. We'll see how it plays out, you know, in the coming months of the way that the ripple effect of it. So these are the people of the fourth wave. And there's the Squad, and we have AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and then the Ilhan Omar and Presley. And then over here is Dina Takuri, who is a Palestinian journalist. And so she is definitely a huge feminist and someone to follow right now. AC Dumlau is the person that started the They, Them, Theirs project and the Name Change project. And just has a great book. She does MTV Decoded, and she has a new book out. Let me move this one. Jamila Afghani is a Afghani woman activist, and she's really into education, educating young girls. And there's other people like Malala that I think y'all already know. I'm trying to show you people maybe you don't know. Janet Mock is a trans activist and has been around for a long time. Tina Chin is United States for Women. She's executive director. Leonetta Smokey Simpson is a Native American poet and writer and activist. And then we have these issues that are happening. And so we have 30 states have ratified finally the ERA, but all of these things are happening right now in the fourth wave. So let me get into then, what can we do? So we have lots of things that you can educate. I mean, there's a lot of great publications now out there for girls. And my daughter has actually started her own little YouTube channel of talking about rebel girls and who she really admires. She just did a project on Jane Goodall. So during this time, if you are in self-quarantine or whatever, all the time, we read this every single night. We have 3 women that we read every single night. So encouraging children, and boys need to be educated. It's not just for girls. we can't sit there and educate our girls and empower the girls and then leave the boys. You know, there's a great book, a great film called The Mask You Live In, and it's all about boys and the barriers that boys feel, because boys are not thriving under a patriarchal system either. They're not able to express themselves either, in different ways, but they also are suffering under this. So books that challenge gender diversity and social norms. Ruby was reading Julian as a Mermaid and comparing that to Tango Makes Three, which is about LGBTQI and gender identity. Educating boys on challenging toxic messages on what it means to be a man. Encourage schools to commit to equity and inclusion. So talk to your schools. I talk to my principal all the time. He sees me coming. He's like, oh, Lord, here she comes. So, but that's important. We have to push back. And people don't know what they don't know either. I mean, before I wrote this book with Camille, there were things I didn't know about womanism, and I had kind of heard about it, but Camille really educated me on that. And so there's always more to learn. Encourage consistent critique of gender. Something that has short hair, and people are, she was inspired by Billy Idol and David Bowie. And so she has this rad haircut, but she's mistaken for a boy a lot. And it kind of bothers her sometimes, but other times she's like, no, you know what? You need to rethink what you think about girls and boys. So good for her. Okay, so it starts with you. Listen to understand. Try to listen rather than immediately a different point of view you're coming from. So keep an open mind. Understand your impact on others with respect to their varied experiences. So Camille and I are experiencing the workplace very differently. As a Black woman, she has been asked to show her transcript way more than I ever have. She's a professor, or what we maybe might call a recovering professor at this point. But she has experienced things that I haven't experienced. And we're going to actually be doing a couple of podcasts here soon. So if you follow me on social media, we have a couple of things coming up next week, the podcast coming up in a couple of weeks. Understanding your impact. So that's things that I experience that she hasn't because of our collective history. Understanding that for her, she has a double bind of race and sexism. On top of that, systemic oppression, looking at the ways in which systems have created the cradle to prison pipeline, looking at policing and how young Black men and women, Kimberly Crenshaw talks about young women that have, Black women and older Black women that have experienced police brutality, things like that are just not going to affect white people the same way. So understanding that, and then Indigenous women as well. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and so we have a lot of treaties, the Point Elliott Treaty that has been not respected. There's been a lot of times the whitewashing of the curriculum around Indigenous studies. So there's things like that not seeing representation of yourself in your literature and in your schooling can really be quite horrific and pressing on someone. Understand your and other people's positions of power. So making sure that like you are understanding what power you hold. If you are the boss and you have a person of color under you, or if you have a woman or another woman that's experiencing, like she's a single mother or having other barriers or experiences, understand that when you talk to them, you are still in position of power. You may be friendly with each other, but you're still in a position of power. So understanding those power dynamics. And I talk a lot about that in a lot of workshops that I do, and Camille and I talk about that in the book. So this is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you do not know her, check her out. She's wonderful. She's great, 2 great TED Talks. So deconstruct your own biases about yourself and others. Pause if you suspect you're sending a micro message. So if you think, ooh, maybe I'm talking about that woman's looks too much. Maybe I'm talking about how skinny they are all the time. That's actually really a microaggression. When you are saying, oh, look how skinny you are, because that's then putting us back in a box. Like we have to be skinny. The idea is of, oh, look how pretty you look. Telling little girls, look how pretty you look. Oh, the importance there is being pretty, not being smart, being pretty. So, instead encourage girls and other women, say, hey, I'm so proud of you. I'm so proud of the work you're doing. I'm so proud, you've been such, showing such courage, and be careful when you say courage, because like, don't say, oh, you're really courageous to wear that outfit. Like, that's not what I'm talking about. So, okay. So internally reflect and change your words or actions. So deconstruct yourself, de-school yourself. Start to realize the messages that you're saying about yourself, because what you say about yourself is actually a reflection onto other people. Check with the other person and try to understand their interpretation without getting defensive. So if you think you've said something, or just what I call is the inquiry-based approach. So ask them, is there something that I can do better? I'm sorry, I think I might have offended you. How would you like for me to rectify that? Don't just say, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and come in here and save you. Or I saw you were interrupted in a meeting, I'm going to go ahead and save you. Let's not do that. The best thing to do is ask the person what you can do to be an effective ally for them. And then just apologize and change your words. So this is the last, one of the last slides, and then I'll get to questions. Mentor someone different from you. Sometimes we mentor people that are the same as us. Collaborate and strategize to amplify voices. So create women's ERG groups, employee resource groups, create affinity groups, book clubs, whatever you got to do. Right now, do an online mentoring session or an online, group. Notice you're in other spaces physically, emotionally, and verbally. I tell a lot of women to do like this woman spread in their in the meetings and stuff. Like, do what men do. Go like this, kind of take up some space. Don't diminish yourself, so even physically. But also remember, if you're working with other women, don't go and get into their space either. White women have a tendency to do that. And I have a whole lot of things I can give to white women if you want to hear more. Stand up in meetings and in interaction. So stand up when you see things immediately. The more you do it, it's like a muscle. The better and the easier it gets to see things. You're like, oh, that wasn't right. I'm going to stand up and say something. We have to do that. Interrupt racist and sexist language as soon as you see it. Talk to other people in your lives and hold them accountable. I had a guy in the gym the other day, actually, and at first I thought this was weird, but he was like, did you sanitize? And we just walked in the door. And I was like, well, hold on. And, but, he goes, we have to keep each other accountable. And this was before we all went into self-quarantine. And so I actually, at the time, I was like, that's a little much, guy. But actually, I'm starting to realize that, no, it was a good thing that he did say that, because it definitely stuck with me. So, okay, so if we have some questions.
I'm taking up space, Joy. Taking up space.
Okay. Hello.
Hello. Okay, fam. So if you have questions for Joy, please send them in. You can use the chat feature or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Send in your questions for Joy. So, Joy, I want to go back to what you were talking about, microaggressions. I think most people are pretty familiar with negative microaggressions. But you mentioned like these shrouded positive microaggressions. Oh, you look so pretty today. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
Box. Could you share a little bit more about what that looks like and how we can change the tone, change the words?
Yeah, so a friend of mine just wrote a book called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. It's all about microaggressions, and Tiffany, Jana, and Michael Barron wrote that. And okay, so what I just did there was, I'm always going to shout out other people's books. I come from an abundance mentality that we have. There's plenty of books out there. Buy mine, buy theirs, buy everything, or read them from your library. So the subtle acts and like these subtle microaggressions are those shrouded compliments that are actually quite passive aggressive. So it could be that, say to me, like saying, oh, have you lost weight? That is a huge, like, okay, that first of all, I've been getting that since I was a little kid. Oh, have you lost weight? I'm like, why? Do I need to lose weight? What's the deal? That's a form of body shaming. When somebody comes along and says, and you pick up a cookie or something at the workplace thing, and someone says, oh, I could never eat that. Like, that's basically policing that other person around what they're eating. And women do this a lot. We police each other's diets a lot. And that's really more about you and what your own issues are with your body rather than that other person. But what I've thought of it as is like, oh, you internalize these messages about yourself and then you spew them out onto other women. And that's kind of where the sabotage can happen. And it might seem like it's subtle and it might seem like it's not a big deal, but it's putting us into a box constantly. It's still like, no, this is the box for women. We're going to keep you in there. Don't start getting all, fat positivity on us, because that's not what we're supposed to be doing. So if you're shaming someone for being fat, or slut shaming, or for being, sexually positive and you know, that's a way to keep women back in that box. And so just let us live, let each other live.
Love that. All right. So for those of you who are asking, yes, we will collect a list of all the books that Joy mentioned, and we will put them in the webinar recording notes of this episode that you'll be able to find on our website. So
yeah, I have a list for you, has videos, Pod already created it, and I will share that with y'all.
excellent. Thank you, Joy. So we have a question that seems very, very relevant to this conversation. Joy, tell us the difference between diversity and inclusion.
Oh, big difference. So diversity just means that you have a lot of different people. That's really just what it means. Diversity, and so people are starting to go more towards the word equity, because if you look at equity and power, so diversity just means you have a lot of different people, but if they don't have power, it doesn't really matter. And when we think about workplaces, recruitment and retention, you can recruit a lot of diverse people, but if they don't stay and if they don't go up in the chain, in the power chain, it doesn't really matter to have that many diverse people. Because if they're not staying and moving forward and being promoted, that's not that helpful for them. If they're leaving, find out why they're leaving. So diversity, we want to piggyback on that. Yes, it's good to have diversity, but also we have to create equity. And equity means that, let's say if there's a lot of great graphics that show the difference between equity and equality. So equity is that we have equal access to things, and we're also given the supports that we need because of past historical downgrading of the opportunities that we've had. Equity just means I'm going to also give you some supports here. I'm going to give you equal access to these opportunities, but you're going to need some other supports for that. So that's the difference kind of with diversity and then equity. And then inclusion is just you're including people. And again, when we talk about, we're still using those words, diversity and inclusion, but you'll notice my business is called Equity and Inclusion. And I like to make that distinction because you can have all the diversity that you want, but if you don't have the same access to power and promotions, it doesn't really matter how diverse you are. You have equal, you know, you might have some different representation and different voices, but those voices need to be honored. And in order to be honored, they need to be promoted to leaders. And then this idea of inclusion is just like, oh, this is this thing already happening and we're just going to include you. Instead, what we say in our book is we talk about liberation. And liberation is actually, let's just break up this whole little box that we're all in, and let's look at the ways that we've created structures completely differently. Let's look at it from a liberating way. Looking at it from like, let's be more collaborative. Why do we always have a hierarchy to where this person has the highest power up here and they're the determinant of everything? Why don't we have more of a collaborative way and everybody functions in different ways? And that's just looking at how organizations can be structured differently.
Okay,
There's a lot around that.
Diversity is a variety of peoples. Inclusion is including them in the processes and the conversations.
That's already existing,
Okay.
existing structures. And so why not look at the structure differently?
Okay. Bigger challenge there, Joy. Okay.
Yeah, oh, totally.
Okay, so we have a couple of different questions around the same concern. So you mentioned speaking out when you see racist or sexist language. You mentioned challenging some of the microaggressions and that sort of thing. How do people have conversations with those folks who are exhibiting those types of verbal and maybe written or otherwise behaviors? How do we have conversations also without them getting defensive, which puts up that wall to stop the conversation really?
I love this question. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you're in a safe space. If you're going to be challenging somebody, make sure that your self-care is utmost importance. However, that does not mean that means that your physical safety and your emotional safety, you're not being triggered with past traumas. So that is if you have suffered sexual assault and you feel ready to have that conversation, maybe it was a long time ago and you've done a lot of therapy around that and you feel okay to have a conversation about that with somebody. My whole thing is make sure self-care is the utmost importance. So don't re-traumatize yourself to educate somebody else. That's the first thing. The second thing though, if you're feeling like you're in a privileged and powerful position, so me as a white woman, I will use my white skin privilege to actually have conversations around race in particular. Sometimes sexual assault is a little bit harder for me to have those conversations. I have to really shore up my reserves to have a conversation around it. But when I talk about race, because it doesn't affect me the same way as it does my women of color friends, I feel like that's the time that I can step up and use my white skin privilege and to talk to white people about race and racism. And so what I usually do is I do what's called the inquiry-based approach. And I say, what's your story? So this is a great question. What's your story about this idea of affirmative action, maybe, is a topic that's come up? Because actually white women were the ones that benefited from affirmative action and not really people of color statistically. So when somebody talks about affirmative action and everybody should have equal access to, to schooling, that's not understanding the past systemic racism that's happening today. So what I would say is, what's your story about affirmative action and what's your actual experience of it? So there's a story that we get. There's what the media tells us, what our colleagues tell us, and that's a story. That doesn't mean it's based in reality or truth. That doesn't mean that's actually your own experience. So when you ask the question, what's your story of that and what's your actual experience of that? Have you actually been in a workplace where you have seen affirmative action not working or whatever? Okay, so maybe they say, yes, I have seen that. Okay, but what do you actually know about the situation? Do you know that person intimately? What's your relationship with that person? Did you really know them? Did you really know what they were experiencing? Do you know about systemic oppression? Do you know about systemic racism? Because there are structures in place that keep Black people especially, but also people of color, immigration policies, policies and procedures at work and our organizations that actually keep people from being promoted. My own institution has, a lot of men in power right now. A lot of the women have left. Why is that? So asking questions like that, and when we come from the inquiry-based approach, when you're talking to an individual, you can say, what's your really experience of that? And I've had somebody say to me, well, I've never, a man say this to me, I've never seen sexism in the workplace. I've never, of course you haven't, you're a man. Come on, man. Yeah, I mean, of course you haven't. So what I do though is I ask questions and I dig a little deeper and then I let them kind of uncover for themselves what is actually happening. So you haven't experienced sexism. Well, do you think maybe that's because you're a man? I mean, maybe what's it like to be a man? What are the messages that you got growing up as a man? That you had to be tough, you had to be strong, you had to be the breadwinner. How did that affect you? Okay. Because I think when we uncover for men that patriarchy and white supremacy does not benefit them either. They're put in a box just as much as we are. That's different than what we experience. We as women have more violence, and then people of color even more so. But it's good for them to kind of come from self first, uncover the self, and then start to see, well, do you see now what were the messages you got about Black people growing up? What were the messages you got about Latinx people or gay people or, whatever? So when they start to look at their own socialization and how we've been walking around in a fog of racism and sexism and classism, then it starts to be like, oh, I never thought of it that way. And you just want to plant the seed, and you just know you're planting a seed. It doesn't mean that you're going to see the fruition right in front of you. They're not going to change overnight, but you planted a seed, and it might be 20 years from now, but they might start to see things a little bit differently. And that's how you can get those conversations started rather than just being quiet and silent.
Okay. One more question before we go. And this can be kind of a wide topic, so I want you to kind of narrow in for us a little bit. We had a request for someone being interested in getting more politically involved in specifically women's organizations to move women's issues forward. Are there any political groups that you can recommend that are, women's issues based for all women or for as many women as possible on the inclusivity issue?
Yeah, oh God, there's a ton. One of the ones that you might consider doing is the United State of Women, which is you can become an ambassador for your city and get involved politically. That is one that I think would be really good. You can actually apply to be an ambassador, and then you will work with the community grassroots organizations within your particular geographic region, maybe your city, and then you work with those organizations to promote women's issues. And so it's nice because it's a federally, it started under the Obama administration, and it's called United State of Women. And USOW. And it has a nice big framework for federal ideas, national ideas, but then you can go in your local community, and then in your grassroots organizing, you can actually start to do things from there. So that's one. There's a lot of different other ones. I think it depends on exactly what you want to do. And I would recommend another one that's great is called Citizen University. And they came out of Seattle, and that's a lot of grassroots organizing, and they have a lot of different types of issues if you're interested in that. But it's also, it really gives you the tools for grassroots organizing. So then if you wanted to start something, or if you want to piggyback on with another organization and partner with them, it gives you a lot of great tools for how to do that.
Okay. And
ton more, but I'll send it to you in the resources.
But I have one more. We had somebody send in a request about, you know how people get talked over in meetings?
Mm-hmm.
When you're interrupted. So now that we're all transitioning to a lot more virtual meetings, how can we create spaces to allow people to talk without talking over someone else?
Yeah, oh, that's such a great question. So what you might do is, off the top of my mind, thinking about that, you might put in the, have everybody be on mute and a person raise their hand, and then, yeah, exactly. And just be mindful of that. So I would say, now that a lot of us are online, create a community agreements or guidelines for what virtual online meetings look like, because they are different than in person. And so what happens is somebody else's mic gets cut off if somebody interrupts them. And I watch with my students record themselves a lot for my class. And so that happens a lot with them. And so what I would say is to create some guidelines of, if somebody is talking, let them complete their thought before interrupting. And, you know, and you can say, it's just a technical thing that we should look at, but also, you know, just a nice human thing to do, you know, and kind of come at it from like the technological aspect. So it doesn't seem like, don't interrupt. It doesn't feel like finger pointing, but just if you prevent rather than react, it would be better. So creating community guidelines or agreements, and y'all can collectively do that together.
Excellent. Well, actually, HERdacity is putting together a graphics guide for hand signals while on virtual meetings. So be on the lookout for that.
That's great. That's awesome. Let me share with you.
Oh, you got something?
Our information too.
So if you want to connect with Joy, her information's on the screen. I highly recommend following her on LinkedIn. Check out her website. It's incredibly informative. And if you haven't seen her TED Talk, give it a watch. She's incredible. Okay? Thank you so much, Joy. We have so appreciated your time with us today. I know that we got a lot of information, and I hope everyone out there is able to utilize it in some way, shape, or form to make themselves, their community, and their workspaces a little more positive.